Hey everybody, this is Josh,
This is Dean.
and here we are again with another week of Finding an Agent. And so we want to remind everyone to like and subscribe and leave us a comment down below. And with that, we're going to go ahead and kick off this week. I'm going to start off and I'm going to talk a little bit about my latest submission. I think I'd mentioned to everyone that I'd completed a short story, or kind of a long story. It's about 12,000 words. And I had sent that off to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and I wasn't quite sure what their turnaround time was because there's a little bit of conflicting information between their website and the confirmation email on the submission. But apparently it turns out that their turnaround time is really fast, or else they very quickly knew they did not want my story, because it took about 4 days and I got a rejection on that one. And the rejection I got was fairly straightforward. It just said, dear Joshua, thank you for giving us a chance to read your story. Unfortunately, this story didn't work as well for me as I'd hoped, and I'm going to pass on it for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. So that one didn't go very far, but at least I know the result of that submission, and so I don't have to sit around and wait for too long on that. So that's kind of where I'm at. Dean, what about you?
Well, I have been outlining for my latest novel that I've been writing, which is a legal thriller / crime type novel with a lawyer as the main character. Big surprise. Know something about that. And, I think we've gone over this before. The way I outline is I use note cards like these, this size, finger for comparison. And I just write scenes on them, and then you kind of can organize them however you want in order to get your scene. So I've got a pretty good sized outline going on. I'll show you the thickness. It's about like that. So,
Okay, wow. And so each one of those cards is a scene, right?
Right.
Yeah, so you got a lot to work with there.
Yeah, and I lay them out usually on my bed because it's the only thing that's big enough. I was thinking I probably need to get like an architect's drafting table or something in order to be able to lay them out and really get an overview of what's going on, and I can move things around that way, because some things chronologically maybe something needs to be moved over here, because this needs to happen before that kind of thing, or just this just needs to be here because this information needs to be here. And then the other thing I do on my outlining, which I don't know if I've mentioned before, is I have a notebook, and I just, especially as I'm writing scenes, I'll kind of write out my options, for what I could do and how that works with the other things. And it really helps for me to be able to write things out. So I've got, this notebook is just for this novel, and I'm halfway through it. So, I usually fill up one of these on a novel. So those are two techniques.
Oh, so I was going to ask a little bit more about the notebook. So is that where you're just you're laying out the scene, like writing out the scene structure? Or
sometimes, yeah, I sometimes will have reference, and in the note card I'll see scene notes from such and such date, page 2. But usually that's more for, the notebook is more for getting it clear in my head what I need to do and what a scene needs to look like. And I'll write scene options out. So I'll be like, the protagonist is trapped in a, room with water filling up, or whatever the hell it is. And, how is he going to get out of that room? And I'll write out, here's, 5 to 10 options for how he can, solve that problem and move on to the next scene, basically. And so that's kind of what the notebook tends to be used for. And I find it useful too, because the notebook, if with me at least, and this isn't just for writing, this is for all of life. Like, if you have problems, I find that writing out your problems and trying to come up with solutions and actually writing it down really helps clarify your thoughts. Whereas if you just keep it in your head, it's kind of abstract and not particularly real.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you have any idea like how far you are in the process of completing your outline or your scenes? Or
I think I'm pretty close. I've got it, since it's a mystery, I've kind of got, I think, that enough clues worked out for my character that he can probably solve the mystery in a realistic and logical way. But I think I may have to have another little subplot or something thrown in there to kind of have a little, for lack of a better word, filler, because I think there's not quite enough there at the end to really fill it out. So I'm gonna have to work on fleshing that aspect of it out tomorrow when I work on it.
All right. I guess the only other thing that I have to touch on this week is if I kind of briefly mention what I've been reading. And I've talked a little bit in the past about reading Stephen King's Everything's Eventual and some of the stories that I've read. And this week I read a story. It's called LT's Theory of Pets. And it's a little bit lengthier story. I think the story is about 50 pages long. And this one was pretty interesting to me because, again, like I've mentioned with some of the other stories, this one doesn't really have a supernatural element to it. It just has a little bit of a dark tone. But it's about a guy whose wife came up missing, and he kind of makes light of the fact, I guess, or I don't know if he makes light of it, but the way he relates the story of his wife going missing to other people is that it's kind of based in the context of the pets that they own. And the story talks about how the guy who is telling the story, the one whose wife went missing, he bought a dog for his wife and gave his wife a pet as a gift. And no, I have that backwards. So the way this one works is the wife bought a dog for the husband. And so she gave him this pet as a gift, but the dog hates the husband, and the dog takes to the wife, even though it's supposed to be the husband's pet. And so then the next year he gets her a cat for a gift, but the cat hates her and takes to the husband. And so it's like they have pets, but the pets have their wires crossed and they don't really love the people that they're supposed to be belonging to. And the whole story really is about the interaction between the people and the pets. And then at the end, we find out that the husband and the wife split up and she leaves, and apparently she gets abducted along the highway or murdered along the highway. Anyway, she just disappears. They never found her body, and you never know what happened. But that's almost like, yeah, that's almost like an epilogue or something.
Wow, that's a hell of an epilogue. Oh, by the way, my wife was violently murdered. And
yeah. And so they don't really know exactly what happened to her. All they know is they found the dog dead. But he makes it very clear that the husband didn't do it, because that was kind of my first thought was, so, well, the husband must have done it. But no, he makes it very clear that the husband didn't do it, just that the wife came up dead. But it's really interesting because it's like 50 pages of him talking about the odd relationship between him and his wife and the pets. And I think I'm pretty sensitive to all of this. Like, I'll admit up front, I'm a little bit sensitive to all this stuff, because when I wrote my novel Hellbender, I submitted it to one outlet to get a review on it. And I was pretty proud of the work. And when I got the review back, the review was not as good as I'd hoped it would be. It wasn't bad. I would call it a pretty mediocre review. But one of the things that the review kind of hit on me about was they didn't think my horror novel was horrific enough, which I still find pretty bizarre, because in the review, they compared my book to a Stephen King book, but then they acted like my book was not really scary like a Stephen King book. And then I read all of these books and stories and stuff by Stephen King where there's really not a horror element to it or even a supernatural element to it. And yet, I mean, let's be honest, Stephen King could take a dump in a paint pail and they would call it a horror novel.
right.
And it would sell 1 million copies and it would all be fine. And they would find some way to praise the artistic value of this, about how he's reinvented the horror novel. And then I write a novel that does legitimately have supernatural horror elements to it. And I get told this isn't really a horror novel. It doesn't measure up to Stephen King and what have you. So anyway, I just think it's interesting that I continue to plow through this book of relatively long short stories to where there is no horror element whatsoever. And yet he's continually praised as the master of horror.
I guess, there's rules for the big guys and rules for everybody else, kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of the story of life too, right?
Right.
So anyway, that's pretty much what I've been up to. And did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, we'll wrap up this week's episode, and we'll get back to you in another week and let you know what we've been up to. Take
All
care,
right.
guys.
Take care.
Sorry, I got to start over.
I don't know why that's backwards. It's really weird.
Ah, shit. All right.
We'll get better at this as we go, I guess. And
You know, what's going into the sausage here?
there's definitely some reflection off my head. Yeah, I may end up in federal prison.